for tuning in to Minds of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Luis Acevedo, and with me today I have a special guest, Stefan Sorgner. Is that how you pronounce the last name?
Yes, Stefan Sorgner.
Sorgner. Okay.
Yeah.
And he is a philosophy professor at John Cabot University. He's also the co-founder of Beyond Humanist Network, and he is an expert in Nietzsche's philosophy. So, Stefan, thank you for coming on the show.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me. It was great already when we talked just before this recording started. It's great meeting you.
Likewise. So if you don't mind, maybe telling us a little bit about yourself, how you got into philosophy, because when I started doing a little research into your work, I found out that you weren't always inclined towards the philosophical journey. You were more so in mathematics. Is that correct?
Exactly. When I was young, actually, sort of my main subjects in school were mathematics, were physics. I was very good at the natural sciences. My parents were very happy about that too. So obviously, it's much more promising. One has sort of a much more stable future ahead working in the field of math and physics. So this was a very strong inclination of mine. But at the same time, actually, I was brought up as a Catholic, and so there was this tension on the one hand with the stories in the natural sciences with the Big Bang, and on the other hand, there was sort of the Catholic explanation of the world, and I was trying to reconcile them. I was trying to find an answer, and the main reason for me actually to turn to philosophy was getting aware of the challenge of death. And I basically was trying to find a reply of how to deal with life and what will happen after death. And this was really an obsession of mine, which started to occupy me incredibly from a very young age. And so I was getting scared, also being aware of the Christian stories, of eternal punishment or the promise of bliss, and then so if this is actually the case, then I thought, well, then I would have to go all the way. I would have to become a priest, maybe the Pope, in order to make sure that what matters most, the eternal life, is being guaranteed to me. So I was considering the option of going in this direction. But at the same time, actually, yeah, I mean, I had a sort of intellectually always been concerned with natural sciences, and so I started to deal with astrophysics and try to find an answer to the question. So yeah, where do we come from? And then it went back to the Big Bang and the question, what came there beforehand? And luckily, I read quite a few books in physics books, which said all these questions cannot be answered by means of the natural sciences. They definitely go beyond the scope of what the natural sciences can answer. We need to deal with philosophical issues. And when I was 13, I had a school trip with to Hamburg, and I entered a secondhand bookstore, and there was a little book which was called On Nature by Heraclitus, and I sort of picked up that book, and that was like just a 100-page book, and with the 130, 40 aphorisms, excerpts from Heraclitus' writings, and each of the writings had an interpretation by Goethe, by Goethe, Nietzsche, by Plato, and basically these are still sort of the intellectuals, philosophers, thinkers, by Spinoza as well, who I still feel at home with. And so after having picked up Heraclitus' books, I started to read Goethe, Spinoza, Plato, and Nietzsche. And Plato and Nietzsche, I've read all of their writings by the age of 20. And so they strongly formed my way of thinking. And I had developed a strong sympathy for Nietzsche's way of thinking, and regarded sort of Plato as the ancestor of Christianity, of dualistic thinking. They became a bit more dubious concerning the dangers of that kind of interpretation of the world. And then after having, embraced Nietzsche, also not always in a critical way, there are many things I've taken from Nietzsche, I developed further, but there are other elements which I find quite problematic as well. But there was a discussion about 20 years ago, sort of around the year 2000, between Sloterdijk, Peter Sloterdijk, a very famous philosopher, and Habermas, who's probably still the number one of German philosophy, the most influential, maybe even thinker in the world. And Peter Sloterdijk gave a presentation in the Schloss Elmau, where he talked about the rules for the human zoo. And he talked about there's a need to reflect upon gene technologies and the possibilities to alter human nature. And we need to think about sort of how to deal with these issues. And in this context, he dealt with Nietzsche, he dealt with Plato, and he dealt with Heidegger. And well, Nietzsche, Plato, and Heidegger, and all of these thinkers are not quite known to be the most democratic or liberal thinkers. So he got a very strong response in the German philosophical circles. And one of the strongest respondents was Habermas, who in his book on liberal eugenics, he actually he quoted parts of the presentation Sloterdijk gave, but without mentioning the name Peter Sloterdijk. And he said, well, Peter Sloterdijk is just basically a transhumanist. Well, actually, he said it's a posthumanist who combines posthumanism with naturalism. And luckily, these crazy people, that's just a crazy philosophy who luckily nowadays not many people take seriously. And that was 20 years ago. And that was the first time when I became familiar sort of with posthumanism and transhumanism. And Habermas, he obviously he regards all of these ways of thinking for fascist thinking, for really dangerous way of thinking, and he rejects all of them. But at least, and I don't think that's a plausible estimation, but that's a separate step. But definitely he's wrong concerning his judgment that it has not caught on in a wider audience. Because at least nowadays, at least 10 years later, from like 2010, 15, 20 onwards, transhumanism and posthumanism have really gained a lot of cultural significance. Basically, in Silicon Valley, most of the leading entrepreneurs and visionaries and thinkers, they regard themselves as transhumanists. And on the other hand, posthumanism is also another type of intellectual, cultural approach, which is much more dominant in the academic, in university circles. And so critical posthumanism is dominant in academia. Transhumanism is extremely popular in Silicon Valley, in Netflix series, in literature, in like literature with, Dan Brown, something which is read by millions of people on earth, in Netflix series like Black Mirror, in Hollywood movies with Johnny Depp, like Transcendence, where Elon Musk is one of the actors, and Elon Musk playing himself, whereby Johnny Depp playing someone whose mind gets uploaded into, on a hard disk and playing through the different implications. So nowadays we can say, so this way of thinking is sort of the culturally most dominant way of thinking, transhumanism, and in more the public Silicon Valley, and posthumanism more in academia, university circles. And that's so for 20 years I've been dealing with these type of approaches. For more than 10 years I've organized conference series dedicated to these approaches. I've established the Journal of Posthuman Studies, which is the first journal in the world explicitly dedicated to the posthuman, where basically posthumanists, transhumanists, metahumanists deal and exchange ideas and critically engage and question the challenges we all are confronted with. But yes, you're right. It goes back a long way, to when I was 13, when I discovered Heraclitus, and Heraclitus introduced me to Plato and Nietzsche. So for quite a long time, I've been dealing with these issues, and in particular, sort of Nietzsche helped me to formulate, to critically engage with these issues, because I think Nietzsche and both post and transhumanist ways of thinking are closely connected. He's been an inspiration both for transhumanism and in a different way for critical posthumanism.
Yeah, and I think the Übermensch, I think it translates over to overman, which transhuman is over or beyond human, and exactly. I can see some kind of connection there. And
maybe actually, just for a short clarification,
yeah,
Mensch means human being. Okay. So that's why I always I translate it as overhuman in order not to have sort of the gender aspect connected to it, because it's not only the man who can transcend humanity, or that man are supposed to be a cultural ideal, but there is no gender aspect in Nietzsche thinking. That's why overhuman, I think, is the better translation.
Right. Fair enough. Fair enough. I guess it's just more so my traditional way of thinking. When I just say man, I'm just applying it to humanity. But anyway, I appreciate the clarification. So it seems like to me, philosophy is the foundation for these natural sciences, because in order to even conceptualize the equation, you need to perform thought experiments. And I think that is in the realm of philosophy. And so to me, it seems that you were interested in philosophy because of it gets to the first principles, essentially. Is that right?
Exactly. Philosophy gets to the first principles. The philosophy is rather sort of, these are the stuntman for the really tough questions. Because in the end, if you do natural sciences, you're only relying on empirical data, on sense data. And of course, sense data is very important. And you manage to repeat certain experiments, and then you try to generate abstract judgment, make abstract general judgments. But in certain cases, the sense data are not sufficient, because, for example, they have got a limited frame. In the end, we cannot exclude depending on the frame, we cannot exclude the possibility that whether the Earth turns around the sun or the sun turns around the Earth. Everything, based on the judgments we have. Now, obviously, it makes sense to say that that the Earth turns around the sun, but maybe from a radically different perspective, it could not be excluded that actually the Earth is the center of the universe. This is not I'm not implying that that's a plausible sense. But we cannot exclude the possibility from some perspective that this is actually the case. And so we need to, when it comes to the really tough questions, we need to apply philosophy. For example, or maybe an even better example is sort of if you try to formulate laws of gravitation. We talk about the apple falling down to earth, and of course we can in a reliable manner make predictions concerning where the apple falls down, or what needs to be considered in order for us to get on a plane and to safely arrive in the United States if we board the plane in Rome. So this works in a reliable manner. But what the apple is, what the plane is, that's a question which we cannot analyze so easily by means of the empirical sciences. Whether it has got some mental dimensions, whether it is only material, what do we associate with materiality? Is there some mental dimension connected to every material aspect? That's a difficult question. That's something which we start off from, basically, in our way of thinking. This is not something, because the mental is traditionally analyzed or referred to as something which we cannot access by means of empirical data. And if we cannot access it by means of empirical data, then basically it cannot be studied by means of the natural sciences. So it is part of the preconditions of our analysis. So the philosophy is sort of something which we start from, or which we have in mind, and then we apply empirical data, and we generate certain information. We adapt our way of thinking. But then once we've adapted our way of thinking, sometimes we also need to revise our preconditions. For example, when Kevin Warwick, he's a wonderful engineer from the UK, and he's like one of the sort of the cyborg engineers, and he's done a lot of like some fascinating research on himself before trying it out on Great Apes, for example. I mean, for example, he's created a brain-computer interface sitting at in New York, I think it was Columbia University, and he got his brain non-invasively got his brain connected to the computer, and established sort of send out information via the internet. And he sent out the information via the internet to a laptop, to a computer in the UK, and the computer was connected to a mechanical arm. And the mechanical arm has got sensors on the fingertips. So by means of his thinking, the information was sent out to the mechanical arm in the UK, and the arm moved down to a table. And the sensors on the fingertips basically felt the surface of the table, and they send the information via the internet to his brain in the United States. And while he was in the United States, he felt what the surface of the table is like, how whether it's smooth, whether it's soft, whether it's warm, cold, and he managed to feel that, you know, on the other side of the, you know, of the earth, or at least a very long way away from the actual table. And if you so what the mechanical arm with the sensors was able to do is what is normally dependent on an arm, on a carbonate-based arm, on an organic arm. And given that research, it makes you question whether there's such a categorical difference between like the carbon-based and the silicon-based, between the mechanical and the organic. And given that research, it can make you change your way of thinking philosophically. It can move away from that dualistic frame of mind. Well, the mental is something outside there. It has no connection to the body. It is something which is empirically not accessible. And sort of these types of experiments made me aware of, no, it is implausible, at least, to conceptualize us as being, you know, consisting of the mind, the mind, which is not empirically accessible, and the body, which is empirically accessible. These two elements are so closely intertwined, are so closely connected, that we need to think them together. And this is sort of that Spinozian way of, neo-Spinozian way of thinking, mind and body. Wherever body is, there is mind. Wherever mind is, there's body. These two things are closely connected. So philosophically, I started off with the preconception, and the natural sciences provide you with new data. These new data can make certain insights more plausible than others, and then it gives you a way also to refine your way of thinking about philosophy. So there's a close connection, I think, even between the natural sciences and philosophy, or there should be. So empirical studies need to be taken into consideration by philosophers, but some elements of philosophy cannot be analyzed by means of the natural sciences, because because such questions of whether a mind, if the mind is in principle not accessible by the senses, by sense data, then it's not something which can be studied by means of the natural sciences. However, certain experiments can make certain understandings of who we are as human beings more plausible than others. So it's just a matter of, so the empirical studies are a way of establishing judgments, philosophical judgments, or differentiating between more plausible and less plausible philosophical understandings. So it's like a circle which interacts between the sciences and philosophy, and that's basically the way I've been approaching these philosophical issues.
Yeah, it seems that philosophy is sort of the nexus between the immaterial and material, you know, because it's like it's taking things that, you can go ahead. You have something to say for that.
Yeah, the imitation. So it's challenging, sort of. Well, traditionally it was philosophy has been firmly rooted in the immaterial since Plato. Philosophy has started from the understanding that we as humans are something immaterial. Our reason is something immaterial. But from Darwin onwards, this is no longer a plausible understanding. After the experiments I just referred to from Kevin Warwick, there is no longer something immaterial. The mental as something immaterial is no longer a plausible entity. And that is a radical revision, actually, of the way we conceptualize ourselves. That the understanding that there is this radical division between the immaterial and the material has become in itself something implausible. And that what we understood as immaterial, namely the mental, is now merely being seen as a different aspect of who we are, of not of the material. Both the immaterial and the immaterial like collapse get twisted, get combined into something which I refer to as psychophysiology. Wherever the one is, there has to be the other. So there's no more material immaterial, but we need to rethink actually that connection between these elements, which are not two separate elements, but they are two different aspects of the one energy which there is. And that is a significant step actually in our cultural history, because we basically, the entire foundation of Western thinking, all the influential Western philosophers like, Plato, Stoics, Descartes, Kant, they all took it for granted that we have an immaterial mind and a material body. And with the post-human turn, and that applies to transhumanism and post-humanism, is this separation, that dualistic separation, is no longer plausible. And we start to rethink what the mental is, and that the mental is a part of the material, that these two things are always connected. And that also needs to, we need to rethink what the mind as an embodied entity. Varela, Thompson, Rush, they wrote a wonderful book. It's entitled The Embodied Mind. And it's a way of explaining sort of how mental capacity can have been developed. And this is also something which I've been sort of dealing with in sort of my forthcoming book, We've Always Been Cyborgs, which is coming out in a couple of months. And it's sort of, no, it's not that there is something, the mind has always been seen as something responsible for language, reason, the mind, it's language, the use of language, it's logic, it's making inferences by means of language, by means of combining sentences and making inferences. But that's an implausible way of conceptualizing what language is or how we develop language. And what I'm trying to say is sort of in tune with the Darwinist turn, is in tune that it's not that language is coming as a consequence of the divine spark from outside. It's not something immaterial which basically gets connected to our bodies at the time of fertilization, but we need to rethink this way. And the mind is connected just by the way it is defined by means of the use of language, but language is something we develop. We've got the preconditions, the prerequisites which are necessary for developing mind, for developing the capacity of language. But in the end, we need our parents, we need our cultural circumstances to being taught language. So language is an upgrade we receive from our culture. Language is an upgrade which, and we're permanently in the process of getting upgraded further by means of education, by means of learning history, mathematics, physics, music, art. And so the latest technologies which we're developing, gene technology, digitalization, they're all like a prolongation. They're in a continuity of who we've always been, namely technologically altered entities. We are technology. It's not technology is something alien to us, but language already is a technology. So that's why we are cyborgs. The cyborg is a cybernetic organism, and cybernetic comes from the ancient Greek. It comes from Kybernetes. Kybernetes is a helmsman, the steersperson of the ship. So we are steered. We are technologically altered organisms. That's why I've sort of coined the phrase, we have always been cyborgs. So because language is connected to us being humans, that's always been the definition of, humankind. But instead of us developing language as a gift of our God, coming from outside, coming by means of a divine spark, language is something which we have generated, we have developed as a consequence of cultural processes, of parents upgrading us with language. And that's a radical, actually, that's a paradigm shift concerning the way we conceptualize ourselves. And so it's a way to rethink, to not start from the duality of the material and the material, but to rethink everything in the sense of everything is psychophysiology, where these two elements are always intrinsically connected.
Right. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm sort of picking up here with what you're explaining is consistent with like Eastern tradition's view of non-duality.
Exactly. This is exactly the case. It is very close to the traditional Eastern way of conceptualizing the world of non-duality. What you said is actually, I've used that. I've used the same words in a presentation sometime in South Korea, and I said, well, this is very much in tune with the Eastern way of thinking about, non-dualistic way of thinking about the world. And then I was corrected. Well, partially corrected at least, and I was informed that actually the majority of people nowadays in South Korea, for example, are Christians, and many of them are Catholics, and many of them are recently been converting from Catholicism to evangelical movements because Catholicism was not rigorous for them enough. But that aside, so when we think about Eastern Asian way, we still have that non-dualistic way of mind, thinking in mind, which is not actually the case in many of these countries. Sort of the Christian ways of thinking have become quite dominant, have become quite strong. But at least, of course, the traditional Eastern ways of thinking, they actually embody this non-dualistic way of thinking from Buddhism, Shintoism, Taoism. There, the non-dualistic elements is particularly strong, and it is still in tune. Actually, it is still even the way, even how Christianity is lived in many of the Eastern countries, maybe has quite some strong resonances and influence from the traditional non-dualistic ways. I mean, if you go to many of the temples, I saw many temples who are dedicated to different religions at the same time, and for the believers that was not a problem. So you can believe in the one thing as well as in the other, and you can worship the same gods in the same church, in the same temple. And I think that's that's a very plausible way of approaching that for people. And I think, and I've got a friend, for example, who's a transhumanist in Germany, but he's also a professor of Catholic theology. So, and he sees there's not necessarily a conflict between being a Catholic theologian or being a Catholic and being a transhumanist. If you interpret that also in a weak manner, in the sense of, of course, you mustn't have the traditional understanding. There is the only good, which is outside, which is the immaterial, which is the God, which is far removed from this world. And then there's a material world, which is full of change. And there's a categorical duality between this. This is a way which is not in tune, obviously, with this, the transhumanist, post-humanist way of thinking. However, this is not necessarily the case how to present, for example, Catholicism either. There are many Catholics. I mean, I've also had discussions with a Catholic who was a Catholic as well as a Buddhist priest. So one has to be careful of just identifying the religions always with a very specific stereotype. And all of the different traditions are much more multifaceted than how they are often being portrayed. And I think that's a central element of what I'm trying to show also with respect to the transhumanism. It's a transhumanism. They don't have to be the ones how they are often presented in the public media. The ones who think, we want to become immortal by means of mind uploading, or we want to become Superman on Viagra or Wonder Woman on Botox, and that's the goal of transhumanists. It is much more complex, and this is definitely, that might be shared by some transhumanists, but I don't find this way of dealing with transhumanism, this approach to transhumanism, a plausible one, and I've got, present loads of arguments why I find that quite problematic, actually. In the same way I find it mind uploading. I don't think that's a necessary part connected to transhumanism in the same way. I don't think personal immortality is something which we can make sense of. And none of these goals have to be associated with transhumanism. So, and it is extremely interesting, the question you've been alluding to, sort of concerning the connection between religiosity, technology, and transhumanism. Also concerning, there have been some wonderful studies concerning the possibility of having religious experiences by means of psychoactive substances. In the University of London, in the hospital, where it's not the case, obviously, that the psychoactive substances actually cause the religious experiences. If they cause them, then they would they wouldn't be religious experiences, because they would be based upon the drugs someone is taking. But it is something, they are questioning the possibility whether some substances like bodily practices like meditation can open up the possibility to realize, to have that one has the possibility of experiences, such religious experiences. So these are very interesting questions, and they are also being dealt with and studied quite intensely in among a certain group of scholars and intellectuals who deal with this.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about Nietzsche's philosophy and his hypothesis of the eternal reoccurrence. Because I think it kind of ties into sort of what we're talking about here, since we're diving into a little more of the spiritual and mystical realm. With the eternal reoccurrence, I know that from the work I've seen of yours anyway, you make the connection that Nietzsche could be a transhumanist. He could be supporting some transhumanist thinking. But then when I think of eternal reoccurrence and transhumanism, they seem like to contradict one another, because if I understand eternal reoccurrence, it's basically just like this infinite loop that you're just in this cycle forever. And therefore, if you're in this cycle forever, there's no progress, which is the opposite of what transhumanists are saying. I mean, there can be progress, but it's always just going to be a loop, if that makes sense. So
exactly.
Exactly.
No, you're right. But there's no tension between that. But there is progress within the loop. But at the end, sort of, there will be one stage at which everything in the world, one state of the earth, will be identical to a prior one, and then the loop will start again. And that's actually a thought which has a long history in philosophy, which goes back to Heraclitus. And Heraclitus was the one who made me first aware of that concept of the eternal recurrence. He referred to it as the great year, and he said how long it lasts. Obviously, it's just a metaphorical amount of years. He said the great year lasts 10,800 years. So take 10,000 AD, meaning a very, very long period of time. And then there were Pythagoreans, there were Stoics, who also embraced the idea of the eternal recurrence before. So Nietzsche was only someone, I mean, he picked it up and he tried to justify or explain this thought. He thinks it corresponds to scientific ways of thinking. And he even considered studying physics, already having been a professor of classics in Basel. He considered moving to Paris for 10 years to study physics and to prove that the eternal recurrence is a plausible scientific hypothesis. And he played around with the thought a lot, in particular in his unpublished writings. I mean, in the writings he didn't publish himself. They were published after his death in his notebooks, and they are now accessible. So he played around a lot with different reflections in order to show that the eternal recurrence is a plausible scientific hypothesis. Actually, all the reflections which he put forward are non sequitur. Actually, the premise, the conclusion does not follow from the premises. But he had some very good thoughts. And again, in the forthcoming book, actually, my final chapter, I directly deal with the eternal recurrence, with the great year, because I actually think it's the best possible, the only possible, the most plausible option for a non-dualistic way of thinking, for having a kind of a reply to the question of the meaning of any lives, of finding something, a meaning which goes beyond our own limited lifestyle, life periods of life periods on Earth. Something, but it goes beyond our limited lifespan, but has a relevance for our lives. You know, because if so, let's assume this is actually this is actually the case, the eternal recurrence. That means whatever you do right now, whatever we do, us talking, it will recur infinitely often. So that means, you know, you better watch out that you're making some good choices, no? Because whatever you do is that you will have to do infinitely often. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's not, in the end, it's not up to you. There's no, in such a way of thinking, there's no possibility of you actually having a free will. Free will in a metaphysical sense does not make any sense in that way, in that such a frame of mind, because obviously you've done it infinitely often before. And the right way of phrasing this is actually not even, it's not like, it's not the next turn or the turn after, because it's always the same. Because only recurrence means there's only one cycle. It's not like the n plus 1, n plus 2, but it's always the same cycle, because if there is identity in the strongest sense, there is not another, because another would have to imply a linear progress of time. And that's a challenge. Just to reflect upon these issues means our way of thinking. Whenever we think about time, we think about time in a linear way. We think about there's today, there's tomorrow, there's a before, there's a later. So our ways of thinking about time always imply a linear directedness. But when we embrace that eternal recurrence, in the end, there is no linear directed time. It's a circular time. And that's radically different way from how we experience the world. So we always experience the world in this linear world, but once we start thinking about it, and even when we start thinking about it scientifically, actually the circular way of embracing, of conceptualizing time makes a lot of sense. And all the various premises, and actually both in a former monograph and in the one in a book on Nietzsche, on metaphysics without truth, but also in the next one, I'm analyzing the various premises necessary for the eternal recurrence to occur. So which premises are metaphysically are necessary in order for the universe to actually have the eternal recurrence of everything. And the basic thought is we need to eliminate any kind of infinity in our premises, because infinity cannot be conceptualized, because no infinity can be completed. If we think about completion, we only can complete a finite amount of progress. Infinity can never be completed. So in this way, we get rid of infinities in our ways of thinking and our premises on what the world consists in. So instead of having an infinite energy, we have a finite amount of energy. Instead of an infinite amount of states which energy can take in, we only have a finite amount of stages which energy can take in. Instead of not having a determinate law, we need to have a determinate law which governs the world. Not like the four laws which we now have in physics, like gravitation, electromagnetic, the strong and the weak force. But what the physics actually tries to combine these four forces into one great unified theories. So we need to have one law governing basically the world, one determined law. And so if the entire realm of energy which we have in the world is finite, if the state the energy can take in is finite, so all the energy states get altered and get altered again. But if there's only a finite amount of states and a finite amount of energy, we will get to one state in the progress, in the history of the world, where all the possible stages have already taken place. So if you have the same type of arrangement of energy, identical to a prior one, and you have the same law governing the energy, it's necessary that the cycle starts again. It's a necessary way of thinking, also in a scientific manner, about the cosmology. And all of these various premises are actually plausible from a scientific perspective, and they are shared by physicists. Actually, there are quite a few physicists who regard this as a plausible interpretation of the universe. And so the eternal recurrence and the premises necessary actually appeal to a scientific way of thinking. Furthermore, it also has implications for our ways of life, because basically any of the choices we make will have to be repeated infinitely in the future. And even if there is no free will, we experience the world as if there was a free will. We experience the world as if there was a free will, because we don't know what will happen next. We don't know whether, there will be a hurricane. We don't know whether there'll be an earthquake, another volcano, another eruption. We don't know all of this. And because of this, we think sort of our decisions matter. But sort of from an intellectual perspective, actually from scientific, but also philosophical, we cannot conceptualize the notion of free will. But we experience the world as if, because we don't know what will happen, as if we act freely. And all of these different aspects of the world are in tune with the eternal recurrence, and they imply the eternal recurrence. And all of these ways of thinking and all the various aspects are actually in tune with the scientific and the naturalist way of conceptualizing the world, and of the various aspects which many, if not most, transhumanists, what most of them also share. And I personally find I've been thinking about that, for a long time, and it really makes it. I mean, I cannot prove that. I cannot, but it makes a lot of sense to me, and it also gives me quite a lot of comfort in my way of acting, in the way that, if you're scared of something, if something bad could happen, you just, you make your way think, it's not plausible that we are actually, that we could actually change something. In the end, it's fate. It's something which happens by necessity. And in the end, you need to learn to love your fate that
That's what
Nietzsche
Nietzsche
said,
says.
amor fati. No, but actually Spinoza held the same perspective. He was in agreement with, and he referred to that as amor intellectualis Dei, as the intellectual love of God. Here, God being everything. You need to intellectually embrace your fate, your destiny, and that's the best you can reach. And once you've reached that, that's sort of the best state you can reach. And it helps me. I find it plausible, and that's the way I try to deal with issues. And also when I'm confronted with dangerous and problematic and threatening situations, that's also a very comforting way of thinking about it.
It seems to me that it's similar to a lot of what the mystical depths of these religions try to teach as well. If you look at Christianity from a mystical perspective, when Jesus says in Revelation that he's the beginning and the end, you can look at that as some sort of eternal reoccurrence. And in Hinduism, there's the idea that I can't remember who you said gave this time frame. Was it Heraclitus that gave like 10,000 years?
Yes,
yeah. So the Hindus, at least a certain sect, because I can't just generalize, because I know there's a lot of different interpretations when it comes to these religions, but in a certain, at least some of them have the same sort of idea that there's a time frame that the earth is, or not the earth, but the universe is sort of, it dies and then it comes back to life. So I see this, like I said, it's compatible with a lot of these religions, what they're trying to teach at the mystical level, which is the deepest level of these religions. And I can see why people are hesitant to accept these thoughts or even entertain them, because we have this negative connotation with nihilism, that there's no meaning to it. But I think that there's a certain beauty, as you were describing, in that, okay, well, there's no objective meaning, and maybe you don't have necessarily free will. However, you're under the illusion you do, and then you are also under the illusion that you can create your own meaning, which for the time being is sufficient.
I perfectly agree with what you say, and and I know there's a widely shared hesitance to praise, or many people fear nihilism. I think nihilism is one of the greatest achievements we have. Actually, I defend it. I think it. Firstly, it's plausible, but also I think the implications are such that they are in our interest, also from a moral perspective. So I distinguish two different types of nihilism. So there's aletheic nihilism. Aletheia means truth. So there's a nihilism concerning truth, and there's an ethical nihilism. And the aletheic, the nihilism concerning truth, is basically the perspectivism. I find highly plausible. Perspectivism meaning every philosophical judgment is an interpretation, whereby an interpretation doesn't mean that what is being said is false, but merely that it can be false, which basically means every philosophical judgment can be false. You cannot guarantee of the fundamental validity of any of the philosophical statements. That applies to your statements, but that applies to my statements, that applies to Nietzsche and Heraclitus as well. And if you start from such a stance, so nihilism here means that all the values we have, the norms we have, they are merely contingent nodal points. They are something which humans have created. They're based on human interests, maybe on human needs, but they are contingent.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that the genealogy of morality is also Nietzsche's work that really describes what you're saying very well. And, he takes a deep dive into where do our morals come from. And as we see, when you really analyze it, it's subjective on the culture.
Exactly. He clearly analyzes what are the inclinations, what are the motives behind humans having created specific norms? Why are they interested in them? Why do Catholic priests have to cannot marry, because once you're married, you can't give away, you can't keep secrets, and the believers need to come to you to give confessions, but you cannot, hide the secrets you received from your wife. That's what sort of Nietzsche says, in order to analyze the underlying logic, why there is such a strength in the concept of the Catholic priest, and why the Catholic priest is seen as quasi such a very strong figure, because he cannot live he can manages to live without the pleasures, without the sensuality. That's quasi superhuman strength. And there's a psychological dynamics connected to it, why people look up to someone who has these capacities. And he tells a brilliant story, basically, how Christianity has developed on the basis from the slave morality in antiquity towards becoming the dominant morality in the Middle Ages. And then we've moved away from it during the Enlightenment process, at least in a specific form. I'm not saying, that that one has to abandon Christianity, but at least the way as it was presented during the Middle Ages, that's no longer a plausible way that we, atheists or witches need to be burned, and there's this rigid good and evil connection. That's no longer a plausible way of conceptualizing Christianity, in the same way as it applies to any other kind of fundamentalist or radical approach, religious or non-religious approach, which is highly dangerous. And yes, and so the genealogy shows the motives and interests underlying the norms and values, and the same as the archaeology of Foucault. And I use the term pedigree of how the various pedigrees of norms and values have come about. And that means any kind of norm and any kind of value is a contingent nodal point, is something, it's a fiction. It's a fiction which is being created. And again, I'm really happy about my next book. And here it says, I'm presenting a fictive account of a fictive ethics of autonomy. So autonomy, I think autonomy is a wonderful achievement, but sort of what I'm defending is a liberal ethics of fictive autonomy. We cannot even conceptualize the notion even of autonomy. Autonomy can, on a metaphysical grounding, can only be conceptualized if you assume that we've got the immaterial soul which is connected to the body. That's wherein our autonomy lies, but that's no longer a plausible story. So, but on the other hand, in an ethical realm, I think it's affirming autonomy, that we as, it's my decision, and I have the right of morphological freedom, educative freedom, reproductive freedom. We need to leave the individuals decide and unfold their personal desires, drives, and needs. I think that's a wonderful achievement, that we can individually make these decisions. But so autonomy on an ethical perspective makes a lot of sense. But if we reflect upon what would be needed of having metaphysical autonomy, it's an absurd notion. So it is just something which we humans have created, but that doesn't mean we have to abandon it. That we can, I think, sort of the moral implications are such that we actually need to stick to certain fictions in order to have some structure in our lives. But these fictions might not be, they might not apply in 100 years' times and 200 years' times. So we always need to be open to get adapted to the new demands and the new needs, and maybe to new information. So there's not even to autonomy, which I find a wonderful achievement, but even such a concept is something which, given revised circumstance and further information, we need to adapt and revise. And it's this openness, if we embrace that that weaker stance, this openness towards other ethical perspectives, I think it also helps you to better live together with others without violently telling them, paternalistically telling, this is how you should live, and trying to have an openness to the other, obviously only as long as the others don't force you to live according to their fundamental understanding of how one should live one's life. So the freedom of someone is always limited by the freedom of someone else. And even though this is a fiction, I think it's a fiction, but I think it's a wonderful fiction. We live in that ethical nihilism, but I think so. This ethical nihilism is a wonderful achievement, and we should even promote it much further. We should enable much more people to live according to their very own understandings of what it means to live a good life. Yeah.
Right. And I think that there's also this negative connotation when you're bringing up that this is all fiction. However, when you look throughout history, mythology has been crucial to give society purpose, to give people a sense of togetherness. And I think that I could be wrong in my interpretation because I'm no expert like yourself when it comes to Nietzsche's philosophy or philosophy in general. But when I started reading a lot of his work, I understood that he's misunderstood by a lot of people, at least from my own perspective. And where I'm getting at here is when I first read that, God is dead, I thought about that for a long time. And it seems to me what Nietzsche was attempting to explain is what you're explaining is this adaptation of fictions to give social cohesion. And what we're seeing today is the fictions of yesteryear are crumbling. And we're now trying to build new structures. And this is where transhumanism comes into play. Or I want to talk more about posthumanism, but I would assume that also is there. And then you also see these, I would say, almost regressions in religion, specifically Christianity, because in antiquity, it wasn't as clear cut as it is today what it meant to be a Christian. There were a lot of Gnostics. If you look at the Paul's school of thought, a lot of Gnosticism is embedded in there. And I think that we're seeing this revival, which we call the New Age, today. And now this is what I believe Nietzsche is talking about as we progress, and we're gonna, people say that he predicted, like World War II or things like that, but I think he was just explaining the process that happens throughout human civilization forever.
I agree, and in particular when you said sort of concerning the notion of God is dead. God is dead. God is dead also means God was once alive. But
Right.
What does it mean if God was once alive? It was once alive that there was a certain idea of God as the infinite, as the fundamental valid reality, which was practically relevant, which people believed in. And yes, of course, in the Middle Ages, it was widely shared that there is this God, the judging God, the all-powerful, the all-loving God, who exists as the reality, who decides upon what is the good and what is the evil. And there is something like the good and the evil. And this is exactly, God is dead in the sense of meaning what I explained before when I talked about aletheic nihilism. So yeah, we abandon, we get rid of, we no longer find it as plausible that there is this one notion which is the truth, and only if you subscribe to this one truth, you'll live a good life. You have got the one and only true reality. No, we realize there's a great plurality of different perspectives, and we cannot make sense or to conceptualize on an ultimate basis that there is one criterion for one being ultimately superior to the rest of possible perspectives. We have got different drives and interests and longings, and this is as far as we can go. We need to stabilize contingent rules, contingent nodal points, rules and norms for us to live well together, so that the greatest plurality of flourishing in our society is possible, that the greatest plurality of different lifestyles can be realized. And so God is that has to do with the truth as in correspondence to the world, as there being one answer. This is no longer a judgment which we find plausible. So we are moving, that used to be plausible, that used to be the truth as it was shared by the majority of people in the medieval, European societies. But now we're moving away from that in the sense of living much greater plurality and much more focused on the various interests and interests and longings and desires, which are so strongly connected to our bodily drives, but also to the cultures we live in. And very often there's a tension, actually. Sort of, you might have a certain interest which you identify with living a good life, but because of the culture you're surrounded with, the culture has created a certain norm which you've integrated in your own way of being in the world. Then there's a conflict. You want to do something, but sort of the culture hinders you from doing so. The culture tells you, no, this is not really what you should do. And so we need to, and this is a really tricky challenge, because this is because the norms can be integrated in our own system. And so we need to realize what are the really dominant, what are the drives which are really important for us. And we need to free ourselves from something, which the culture has implanted in us, has installed in us, which stops us from doing something without it causing any harm to anyone else. And that is a very difficult choice to make, to separate sort of what is really relevant for your own being in the world and what are sort of structures, encrusted structures, which culture basically has made you do. And to be able to distinguish these two elements, one needs to find a way to dare also to free oneself from something which stops from really realizing one's own fulfillment. I mean, many of the structures are also very helpful in the sense of, when culture creates structures which stops you from harming another person. Maybe for someone, harming another person might actually be fulfilling, but obviously we cannot allow that, because we don't want some innocent person to get harmed without any good reason. So that's why the rules are also very important. But unfortunately, there are still too many rules, in the sense of where things are forbidden, even though they are not causing any harm to anyone. And this is where I'm trying to show now, we really have to get rid of some of these encrusted structures in order to generate, to promote human flourishing further.
Right. And I think that this is also deconstructionism is another thing that gets a bad rep, because it's deconstructing what is our foundation, what are, our society, our norms. However, I think the people who are the most innovative tend to reverse engineer stuff to find out a better way to do it. And I think that that's what to some extent, a postmodernist is, whether they know it or not, are trying to do, is trying to point out the flaws. And then, not all the time, you don't see this all the time, because then you get a lot of this just like tear it down and let it burn. But with that, there has to be just this cycle. You have to complete the cycle. So you're going to destroy the old, so that way you can bring in the new. And another thing that you were touching on there,
just to stress that one point further. So it's, yes, you do find in postmodernism, and I completely agree with actually a summary of postmoderns here. But you also find it, for example, in economics. There is someone called Schumpeter, and he's like one of the leading figures in economics. And he has read Nietzsche, and he coined the phrase "a successful entrepreneur." What entrepreneurs need to do is creative destruction, to destroy the old field of enterprise in order to create something better, to get rid of the cars which run on gas, and to create a Tesla model. You need to destroy something to create something new. And so that's what a very, very successful innovative entrepreneurs need to do. So it's not something which only happens sort of in the philosophical realm or cultural realm. You're actually on a very practical level, entrepreneurs, engineers, economists. This is also in these fields, the same kind of logic applies. But I interrupted you.
No, thank you for bringing that up, because it made me realize that what we're talking about, I would argue, is a form of godliness. If you look at what, it is, I don't necessarily believe in there's a creator, but in the concept of like creation and godliness, there's this, like we talked about, these cycles of, destruction and reconstructing. And anyway, so I wanted to circle back around to what I think you were describing as the social contract, because we're bonded by the society, and that's what you were alluding to. And so to sort of switch gears here and jump into transhumanism and posthumanism, how do you, well, first, I think it'll be important to define what the two are. And then after that definition, how do you think the social contract is, if you believe in that theory, which I think you do? I think to me, it's obvious that it's real. But how do you see that changing with this advancement in humanity? Because there's going to be a lot of tension. As we were talking beforehand, like even myself, I was very skeptical and antagonistic towards these way of thinking. But anyway, if you want to define the two answers and then maybe go into the social contract.
So I've just, as a brief trigger warning, a comment to sort of the question. I've developed a course on posthuman studies here at John Cabot University. So I'm basically introducing transhumanism and critical posthumanism, differences, similarities, and in order just to, it's not as easy as it might sound initially. Sort of the initial concepts which come to people's mind when they first hear the notions, you directly have some sort of connotations, but I'm pretty sure that they don't correspond to what these two cultural movements actually stand for. It takes me until the midterm, half of the semester, then the students have a clearer understanding of what critical posthumanism and transhumanism is, because they actually, when one from outside sort of embraces or gets in contact with these approaches, most people identify, or it's easier to grasp what transhumanism stands for, because this is what is widely shared in cultural debates, in Black Mirror, in the various Netflix series, in movies, in literature. When you read journals, it's sort of the idea of using technology in order to transcend, to move beyond the boundaries of currently living human beings. Why? Because if we develop further capacities, it increases the likelihood of us living good lives. That's why we want to get educated. Because if we can calculate math, if we're not going to do math, when I can know language, well, it helps me to live. It increases the chance that I'm living a better life. And the same applies when you use the new technology. When you use it, and you develop even further capacities. And if you become, a successful entrepreneur, or if this is all, the technologies are not only something external, they can also be something internal, language being a technology. There's no difference, this technique and technology, it's not a categorical difference between something external and something internal. And so this also applies to gene technologies and brain-computer interfaces, digital technologies. So in the same way as being able to speak, to write, to calculate helps us to lead better lives, this also applies, if we use the new technologies in the appropriate manner, and we transcend the current limitations, then we've got a good reason to hope that we live a better life. And sort of in 200 years and 250 years ago, we have an average life expectancy on Earth of about 40 years. And now we've got an average life expectancy of 80 years. And, living longer, more healthily, that has already increased the quality of life significantly. And then some people say, but what about the social challenges? And what about, lesser developed countries, and then they look at the statistics, look at the poverty rates. At the beginning of 1800s, we've had a global absolute poverty rate of more than 90% in the world. That means in the entire world, the overall population, more than 90% lived in absolute poverty. Absolute poverty does not mean relative poverty, not relative to their times, but absolute in the sense of, no, there's a daily struggle for survival, of having shelter, having enough food to eat, just to survive. This was 200 years ago. 200 years ago, even in the developed country like in Great Britain, we've had an absolute poverty of more than 80%. And then I'm usually asking, actually, sort of, my students, and I'm wondering, what do you think? What's the absolute poverty rate right now? And many people are, wow. And one thinks, oh, many still think, oh, it wasn't so bad in the past, and there are still so many challenges nowadays. And many say 30, 40%. And if you look at the statistics, and the very good website is Our World in Data from Oxford University, which basically is, brings together the most reliable data. If you look on any topic, it's a wonderful website. And it clearly shows nowadays, taking the entire world into consideration, we've got an absolute poverty rate of about 10%. This is, in the past 200 years, that's such an improvement. Of course, even 10% is still too many. There are still 10% of people suffering and dying every day, which is terrible, which is, of course, there's still a lot of potential for further improvement. But, still there was an improvement of, 80% of the world's population are no longer in that category, are no longer the ones who suffer every day. And this is a consequence of the enormous range of technological innovations which we've generated in the past, in particular in the past 250 years, from vaccinations, from antibiotics, from anesthetics. None of these things have been developed, 250 years ago. Imagine, what a world without vaccinations, anesthetics, and antibiotics. Imagine what it was like before 1900, just on an everyday basis. Nowadays you wake up, there's a smartphone, ringing, making a nice sound in order to smoothly enter the day. You go into the warm shower. You've got central heating on. It's cold outside. It's snowing. You've got central heating. There's a warm shower. You go to the fridge. There was no fridge before 1900. You take your freshly washed trousers. There was no washing machine before 1900. There was no dishwasher. There was no coffee machine. This is, and this is only like 120 years ago. It's just, I'm not saying this is, these changes might not have been as important maybe as antibiotics, but on an everyday basis, having a dishwasher, washing machine, a coffee machine, a fan, a hair dryer, it really makes a significant difference. And this is why we've increased the life expectancy, and not only life expectancy, we've increased the health span significantly in the 120 years. And if we use the new technologies in the appropriate manner, we can significantly increase the health span and the quality of life in the future. So this is like the transhumanist take. And they say, basically, no, we've got good reasons to embrace the use of technologies. Not all technologies are good, but we need to choose the ones which are very, which are very helpful supporters, which serve our interests and needs. So this is a transhumanist state. It goes, actually, transhumanism was coined in 1951 by Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley is the brother of Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. Julian Huxley is the first president, the first general director of the UNESCO. So culturally, politically, very influential figure. He was a biology professor at the University of London, so a very clever guy as well. Um, and 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 he coined the notion transhumanism in 1951, and he basically had that kind of understanding of transhumanism. The notion of posthumanism is an entirely different one. The notion of posthumanism can be traced to a scholar called Iyab Hassan, who taught at the New School of Social Research in New York, and it goes back to the year 1977. So it's actually younger than transhumanism. Critical posthumanism is has a different pedigree, has a different intellectual connection, a cultural connection than transhumanism. Julian Huxley is part of the Huxley family. The great-grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, was Darwin's bulldog. The brother was Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World. A half-brother was a professor of biology, Andrew Fielding Huxley, who also won the Nobel Prize, but he's less known than his other half-brothers. But there's a strong connection to evolutionary theory, evolutionary naturalist thinking. Critical posthumanism goes back to a scholar of literary theory. It goes back to a connection to sort of postmodern understanding. It does not have this naturalist grounding. And the fundamental idea connected to critical posthumanism is basically that we have always been posthuman. That's what Catherine Hale said. I'm using the word to slightly adapt the meaning and combine it with transhumanism. I call this, I refer to this understanding, we've always been cyborgs, in the sense of, what does it mean we've always been posthumans in the sense of Catherine Hale's? She says, well, who are human beings? Human beings, in our cultural understanding, are defined as consisting of a material body and an immaterial mind. But she thinks that's a highly implausible way of conceptualizing humans. We've never had that immaterial mind. This has only been our cultural self-understanding in a certain period of time. That's only a fiction as it was dominant in the times which were dominant, in particular, so in the Judeo-Christian Middle Ages. Then this notion was particularly dominant. Actually, it came about, it was already coined by Plato in the Republic with the immaterial mind. And that's why Nietzsche thinks Plato's, well, Christianity is Platonism for the masses. It's an adaptation of Platonism becoming efficient in our cultural conditions. And so when Catherine Hale mentions we've always been posthumans, I mean, well, this notion of human being as having an immaterial mind and material body, it never corresponded to us as human beings. It's just been a cultural creation, and that has a lot of, but it's been extremely efficient, an extremely convincing manner, which still has enormous implications concerning the way norms and values and anthropological judgments are structured today. It still has legal implications in all parts of the world, in the sense of, in most legal constitutions, it is the case that only humans are persons. Animals legally are supposed to be treated like things. And that's the case. This judgment knows rarely any exceptions. In the German constitution, it says only humans have dignity. Animals are no things, but legally should be treated like things. There's one famous exception in Argentina recently. There was a court case concerning an orangutan, on whether an orangutan should be treated like a person. And it was granted legally that this orangutan is a person. And as a consequence, the orangutan had to be freed from the zoo. But I'm just saying, this is one exception in the entire, world. in most other countries on a legal constitution, we still have the notion of human exceptionalism in the sense of we humans are persons, we humans possess dignity, and this does not apply to the rest of the world. And it's this way of conceptualizing humans, which is connected to this traditional humanism, which critical post-humanists want to overcome. Because this self-human exceptionalism is connected. This is a fiction which is no longer plausible. We are coining different kinds of fictions. We are coining the fictions. We find it more plausible that we humans are animals are credibly different. Of course, we as humans, I mean, we have different capacities. You know, our use of language is not something which an orangutan you can do. But there's like a vampire bats exist in South America, and they can survive on blood only by drinking blood. And that's the only mammal which can survive by drinking blood, which the others, they are exceptional in a different way. But that's not a justification why they should be granted an exceptional moral status. And we can also implement different kinds of statuses. Which moral status we attribute to various entities, in the end, it's an agreement. It's a contract. It's a contract among humans. We establish a certain contract, and we need to negotiate the contract. We need to find a way. This is how we want to treat other entities. This is how we want to treat the fertilized egg. This is how we want to treat an orangutan. Who has more relevance? Who should have a higher moral status? Should it be a fertilized human egg who does not have a nervous system, who does not have a brain? Or should it be an adult orangutan who does have both and who can suffer enormously, based on a traditional notion of Catholicism, which actually was only realized in the middle of the 19th century, because only the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, for example, Thomas Aquinas, up until the second half of the 19th century, took it for granted that there was a gradual animation, that the soul, which is immaterial in that understanding, enters the body gradually. So there was a little bit of soul when fertilization took place, and there was more of a plant soul, an animal soul, but the full soul, for example, according to Thomas Aquinas, the full soul, the rational soul, enters the body only 60 days after fertilization for men and 90 days for women. This was Thomas Aquinas' understanding, but at least it was a gradual animation. In the second half of the 19th century, the understanding changed, and suddenly it became the dogma, it became the general Catholic self-understanding that animation, the animation meaning the immaterial soul getting connected to the material body, takes place during fertilization. And that's why with the immaterial soul, with the divine spark fully being present at the time of fertilization, humans possess dignity, which an orangutan does not possess. That's why the fertilized egg has more moral relevance, has the same moral relevance as you and me, according to that Catholic understanding, than an orangutan who can suffer, who's got a brain, who's got a nervous system. And this is where this traditional humanist understanding comes from. And the critical post-humanists are strongly focused on and make aware that this traditional humanism, Catholic humanism, Renaissance humanism, is we've never been, it never applied to us, and it has a lot of problematic, dogmatic, paternalistic implications. So that in the sense of, well, there are the humans and they're the others. The humans possess dignity, the rest does not. The ones the Pope has that might have the truth in correspondence with the world, whoever is not in agreement with the Pope is definitely wrong, is far away from the truth. In the sense of also, it also has different other types of discriminatory implications, because the truth is the pride and whoever is far is in the dark. There's sort of the black-white distinction. So the dark being a way of being, you know, worthy of discrimination, and the white is sort of that what is God, what is divine, what is good. And it's also got to do with, you know, the ones who is God's rationality, that's a male capacity. The male capacity of rationality, and the women were identified with the body, with the emotions. So, and rationality is the divine, and emotionality is sort of the beastly, that's removed from the truth. So all these various types of discrimination, which are still part of our culture, sort of racism, speciesism, sexism, but also aletheism in the sense of, you know, truth being superior. But in the same way as also types of, you know, different kinds of rejecting different kinds of sexual behavior, because there was the natural law in the sense of which was this dominant understanding within the Catholic Church for a long period of time. It is the understanding that that goes back to Aristotle. It basically that every part of the body was made for a specific purpose. The eye is there for seeing. The nose is there for smelling, and the genitals are there for reproduction. And if you use the genitals not for reproduction, but for pleasure, you're acting unnaturally. This is any kind of sexual intercourse which is not directed at reproduction is an unnatural action. And if you use a condom or the pill, you're preventing something natural from occur. That's why it needs to be forbidden. So we've seen sexism, racism, atheism, speciesism, also discrimination concerning different types of sexual behavior. This is strongly rooted, is connected to this dualist way of framing, which has been extremely dominant in the past 2,500 years. And now realizing, well, it's all not, you know, it's not black and white. You know, it's shades of gray, which are being, you know, there's no one truth and the rest is false. And once we're moving away from that dualistic way of thinking, you know, it also moves away from the various discriminations which go along with this dualistic structure. And that is the main focus of critical posthumanists. And I think both the critical posthumanists and the transhumanists have some very important insights, and I'm sharing many of them. But there are also, you know, some radical transhumanists and some radical critical posthumanists who basically go over the top and who basically take that to an extreme, which is again extreme, highly dangerous. And that would be, you know, in the case of transhumanism, for me, this is sort of the idea. In 20, 30 years, we can upload our personality to a hard drive in order to realize immortality. And, you know, this is not going to happen. You know, we haven't even realized any living entity on a digital basis. This is not a realistic option. I explained that further, you know, also in the next book, but also in many other writings. You know, that would be an example of a transhumanism, of a transhumanism as a hyperhumanism, as something which goes over the top, which, you know, is unfortunately embraced by Elon Musk and his friends, who generate a lot of advertisement and public attention in this manner, and also generate a lot of misinformation concerning transhumanism. But there are also some very crazy people among the critical posthumanists, you know, who have a strong affiliation with postmodern thinking. And they are mostly focused on the problematic aspects which have to do with the human and with the discriminatory aspects. And recently, obviously, as a consequence of, you know, global warming, climate change, they're very much focused on carbon dioxide emissions. And obviously, if you analyze humans, every human emits more, you know, permanently emits carbon dioxide. And as a consequence of realizing that there are some really crazy critical transhumanists who say, well, it would be best for the world if humans became extinct. And, you know, this is as crazy as you know, maybe more crazy. That's, you know, this is a critical posthumanism taking to an extreme in the same way as mind uploading in critical as a radical transhumanism taking to extreme. So both elements, it is important to be concerned, to be aware of the discriminatory natures of dualistic structures and of the of norms and having been created, and the paternalistic implications. And it's extremely important. But then to say to get rid of humans, that's just one step too far, and it cannot be justified, because in the end, of course, who is it there for? Who in whose interest is it? There's no reason why humans have to get rid of our own interests. We have interests too, and it's important that each one of our interests get considered. And that's also why I think sort of such regulation, we say no, in order to deal with issues like climate change and so on, we need to deal with issues like overpopulation. And overpopulation, that might have to imply that we need to impose rigid, in the end, eugenic laws. We need to stop people from procreating. But that's, having a German background, I tell you, eugenics is not something we would want again. We don't need any more eugenics laws. This is any kind of utopia, any kind of totalitarian fascist regimes is something we definitely need to, stop from ever coming about again. And that also applies to, telling people how many kids they want to have, any other kinds of these eugenic laws, which are just extremely dangerous, paternalistic, and we need to take the flourishing of each individual into consideration, and that is what matters. And in the end, and actually, by embracing other technological means, we've got good reasons to hold that actually such an issue like overpopulation can be dealt with successfully, even without making any such regulations concerning procreation. Max Rosa, who's actually the person from the he's an economist from the University of Oxford, and he established the website Our World in Data. And he's done some enormously fascinating research concerning overpopulation. And he showed there are 4 different steps concerning reproduction. And so the less well-off you are, the less well the cultural situations are, cultural circumstances, the social circumstances, the more people procreate. And the more developed, the more education, the better your own quality of life is, the lower is the reproduction rate. And we see that like the reproduction rate undergoing 4 different phases. And countries like Pakistan and South Africa are already in the 4th phase, in the most developed phase. Their reproduction rate already goes down enormously because of the development. And so basically, if we promote the quality of life, if we promote education in the various places on Earth, then this has as a consequence that the reproduction rate goes down. And according to his calculations, the 13th billion person will never be born. And of course, it's unclear whether it's actually the case, but there's some very good, some solid scientific basis and reflection underlying that thought. So instead of introducing eugenic laws, which are dangerous and which we have to avoid at any cost, implementing, using new technologies, promoting the likelihood of human flourishing, the plurality of human flourishing, actually is sufficient and much better in order to even deal with the critical issue of overpopulation. And in the end, that will also have consequences for such a tricky issue as climate change and so on. You see how the various things are entangled from, on the one hand, critical posthumanism, which is one tradition, which very much focuses on interpretation and the cultural domain. Then transhumanism, which is more of a naturalist inclination, which is more about enhancing human beings, and how then we come to a social contract, and we get confronted with the current really tricky challenges like overpopulation and climate change. And in the end, these things go together in the same way as I said earlier, sort of when we dealt with Nietzsche. Perspectivism is can best be explained on a naturalist basis. Naturalism, this understanding that we are part of nature, means that we cannot have any correspondence theory of truth, that all of our perspectives are interpretations, leads to perspectivism, and perspectivism again implies naturalism. The most plausible way of grasping perspectivism by means of or having a perspectival epistemology means that, you know, naturalism is the most plausible ontology of permanent becoming in which we live in. And sort of the aspect of, and critical post-humanists focus on perspectivism, on the postmodern perspective, everything is interpretation, and the transhumanists focus on naturalism, on the permanent, on the ontology of permanent becoming of everything in all respects at each moment. And so basically, and I'm basically, instead of having an hostility, you know, that critical post-humanists rejecting transhumanists and vice versa, we should embrace a good circle between these two movements, in the sense critical post-humanism leading to transhumanism and vice versa, and in this way also getting rid of the radical approaches which have been established or which can be found within both types of cultural tradition. And so this is why I'm, you know, presenting that kind of meta-humanism, which is meta-humanism, which is beyond, and meta means beyond the traditional dualistic humanism, but also its meta is in between critical post-humanism, transhumanism, as well as the traditional humanism. And this is sort of my take on meta-humanism, which I finding connections, finding relations, and trying to avoid any kind of dogmatism and radical fundamentalism and paternalism, because they undermine, I think they strongly undermine human flourishing and just promote violence and hatred.
Right.
I
tend to agree with that. And I think that I haven't done much research into metahumanism. However, what I do know from our conversation now and before we started recording is there's a lot. I appreciate the work that you're doing, because as you're describing transhumanism and posthumanism, there's a lot of things that I agree with both that are just like, it's obvious. For instance, my glasses, you can take, you know, I had a conversation with my wife about what transhumanism is. Like, there's so much, like, you can consider the lotion, sunscreen, a form of transhumanism. The FM 2030, you know, he talked about the telepress, like how we're communicating right now. It's a beautiful thing. The prosthetic limbs that we're developing. You know, there's certain other medicines that I may not completely agree with, like what you're saying, you know, their importance of. However, that doesn't mean that they don't have some sort of utility. And when it comes to the posthumanism side, I agree with the idea of respecting animals more. And one example, like you were explaining, you know, times are different compared to when we were in tribes. Not to say that there aren't people in tribes currently literally living off of the land, and they tend to take better care of nature than we do. It's kind of funny that that's how it works. They're more in tune with nature. But for instance, you know, like when I see a squirrel outside or something, like when I see a dead squirrel and I'm driving, there's a tinge of like, oh man, that sucks. Like, that thing died. Although, you know, I also look at it as food. Like, I'm realistic in that regard that, you know, I have no issue killing a squirrel or killing a deer to, you know, feed me and my family. However, there can be a more harmonious balance, which I see that the post-humanists are attempting to do. And I completely agree with you when you're talking about the uploading of consciousness in that 20, 30 years. It's insane to think of. And I find this to be a common theme, though, when it comes to programming and software, that you say this piece of equipment is going to come out next week, but then 2 years later and it's still not out. You know, you see this all the time. For instance, the first thing that comes to my mind is Ethereum. I'm not sure. I know you're familiar with Ethereum because I've seen you with a picture with Vitalik, the co-founder of Ethereum. I met him
a week before he launched Ethereum. We were together for 1 week in South Korea, in Daejeon in South Korea. He explained it to me like a week before it was actually launched, which was pretty cool anyway.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah, so like with Ethereum 2.0, like there's been talk of this for a long time. There's also been talk of this new fork, the London fork, which I won't get too much into, but um, that's been around since 2017, and people have been expecting it to come right around the corner. So I think we're going to have a similar thing when it comes to uploading consciousness. And I tend to think that it's I do think that it will come to fruition, but not in the sense that that it's being portrayed. And what I mean is this the metaverse that's being developed right in front of our eyes in today's world. I think that you're going to have some form of uploading consciousness from the data being collected from you being in the metaverse. That you'll be able to, maybe your family or something will be able to revive your avatar, and then it'll have your personalities, but it's not necessarily you, but you're in the metaverse. That's what I see more plausible as far as like uploading consciousness. That may seem crazy, whatever. And then as far as like the post-humanist side of things, I do think it's completely insane. It's that you want to get rid of humans because, in my opinion, we're the most resourceful beings on this planet. We're like the most, in my opinion, important beings. I do believe there's hierarchical structures all throughout life, and I believe that humans are at the top of the animal. I do believe we're animals, and I do think that we're just at the top. However, there can be more, as I've already alluded to, and you've already explicitly stated too, that cooperation between species. And I think that we see that when we have dogs, cats, we're more open to keeping these exotic animals as pets now and things of that kind, which people may say is abusive to a certain extent, but nonetheless. Now you're doing like if you could go into more of what the metahuman is or metahumanism is, because I think that like I said at the beginning of this, it's ambitious and it's also realistic, because I think it's like if I understand correctly, the Hegelian dialect, that the truth is like somewhere in the middle typically, and I think that that's kind of what you're attempting to do. I could have a misunderstanding of that, so feel free to correct me, but I feel that that's sort of what you're attempting to do with this school of thought.
Yes, it is. It is. It is based upon certain guidelines, but they are also contingent on little points. But they are like the guidelines. There's this sort of this understanding in the end that there is permanent becoming. There is this permanent flux in which we live. If we want to live a good life, then there's this radical plurality. What might be a good life for you might not be the good life for me, might not be the good life for anyone else. My concept of the good life, the desires and drives, might be entirely only applied to me. There are certain elements which apply to more people, like promoting a longer health span is something which many people identify with the good life, but definitely not all people. That's also something, sort of the avoidance of universality, of making claims concerning any universal validity. That's a very important aspect. Sort of the perspectivism that the things, philosophical judgments we present are interpretations. And so what metahumanism does not attempt to do, it's not a utopia. It's not something we've got the answer and we work towards a utopia. Once these principles are applied in various circumstances, we live in a perfect world. This is not a goal. This is definitely not something which can be aspired, that undermines actually this metahumanist understanding. So the metahumanism is the metahumanism which Jaime del Val, an artist whom I started that movement, the Spanish intellectual and artist, he's got a different understanding of metahumanism. He's got a different estimation, judgment concerning transhumanism as me. But we share some judgments as the ones concerning perspectivism, plurality, and permanent becoming, and avoiding of violence in this way. And this is these working principles can be applied to many different discourses. So once you enter, it's very different if you talk to the traditional a cardinal here in Rome, or if you talk to, you know, someone bioconservative for different reasons, or if you talk to a, you know, someone who focuses on ecology and preserving certain wildlife species, then you need to find in the various discussion, you know, if everyone just presents their own perspective in a radical manner, there is no possibility of any development, of any adaptation. You need to find some common ground, some common language, something which is being shared, where you resonate with, sort of this resonance with the other, which sort of, you know, it stimulates your nerves. It sort of, you realize there is something in this, and then you try to show then what is important, particularly important to you, what is important to the other person, and then the adaptation takes place. Then the thinking is in movement. There's thinking in movement, and people realize, well, maybe I need to rethink this. Maybe this is really problematic. If I, you know, you just mentioned the meat thing, meat consumption, and sort of if you, the thinking in relational modes. So if you, I sometimes do that. It's a type of mindfulness meditation, which I do with, you know, in a class. I sort of say, look, this is here beef, a wonderful bistecca fiorentina, a Florentine steak, or, you know, steak from Argentina. And then think about it. Think about, where does it come from? What are the various interconnections? And then then the people start thinking about, well, there's probably, it's been a factory farm, you know, where these animals were stored, were kept. You know, the animals, they need to pee. They need to, this is like, it sort of enters the soil, and it causes a lot of problems and challenges also to the water, to the earth there. There's a lot of carbon dioxide emissions caused by factory farms. For example, pigs are very social animals, and in these conditions, it's really not beneficial for them. They feel the stress in this situation, and it's always, they're passing on the diseases easily, which means that you always need to feed them with antibiotics, because there's always someone ill. That's why all the pigs need to be given antibiotics all the time. As a consequence of the antibiotics, there's a challenge with, in hospitals nowadays and in general, that antibiotic resistant cells get created. And that's an enormous challenge. If we don't have antibiotics are a wonderful thing. And if we don't, you know, if they don't work, if we've got antibiotic resistant cells, they kill us. This is something which needs to be taken care of. There are further studies which clearly show that if you consume too much, you know, too much red meat increases your likelihood of getting colon cancer. You know, cancer is, you know, it's a serious issue. Many people die as a consequence of cancer. And the way animals are killed, actually, in these circumstances, once you've seen it, you probably turn vegetarian for a couple of days at least. You know, I'm not, the reactions are differently for different people, but I'm just saying, so this is a type of mindfulness meditation just on the issue of, you know, what does that specific piece of meat mean to you? What are the connections to the environment, to your own health, to the well-being of the animals? The animals need to be, the meat needs to be transported. That's another aspect. And so, and that's something which I think ought to be dealt with in schools much further, maybe even, you know, in primary schools. You learn, you know, in secondary, you learn physics, chemistry, but it's your politics deal with economics, but pupils, students don't get the connections. Why is the one thing connected to the other? Why is it relevant? So if you increase the productivity, if you store more pigs in a more limited space, what does it mean? What are the implications? You increase your economic benefits, but actually sort of the health benefits maybe you wouldn't even want to eat that meat anymore because you need to even give even more antibiotics to that. So it's this way of thinking in establishing relations, understanding, thinking in a relational manner about the various issues which you're being confronted with, and then we need to, you know, then we need to develop ways of dealing with it. And in particular, when we think about, you know, issues like climate change, it's very tricky. I'm some, you know, I haven't published too much on that because to have a really straightforward answer or to have a good concept, you need to take so many aspects into consideration. It's really extremely different, and you can only do that in a permanent negotiation, taking political circumstances into consideration. And any kind of radical statement, oh, we just need to forbid, you know, whatever, factory farming, and, you know, stop building coal power stations, that's naive. That's not going to happen. And you know, and the US, Europe, you know, we've benefited obviously on the basis of what we've been doing in the past 200 years. And what's now happening, you know, in particular in China and in India, they're the ones who are now upcoming. China will probably, you know, they have so much innovation. They're publishing each year more peer-reviewed papers, academic papers, than the United States. And that will probably have some economic implications. I think, you know, even as an economic superpower, I find it very hard to imagine that China can be stopped actually so far. But that has already implications concerning the financial well-being of the people living there, which means, and which has implications, for example, concerning more people will have the money to buy a car, and they want to drive a car. And usually, together with the financial status, increase of financial status, there's usually, it increases the amount of people eating meat on a regular basis. So more factory farming will be needed in order to produce the meat which, you know, the Indians and the Chinese will want to have. And that has consequence for climate change as well. Do we then from the West want to forbid the Chinese to enjoy the pleasures we've had in the past 200 years? In China, there's currently more than 100 coal power stations are being built. They're producing loads of, you know, they have the carbon dioxide emissions, you know. And in Germany, we're talking about getting rid of the power stations, and you know, Germany is responsible for 2% of the carbon dioxide emissions. And if we, you know, cut down on that, we might, you know, the power stations, we might remove that by 0.5%. On a global basis, that's not much, you know. And so, you know, these issues are really, really tricky issues. If one country is trying to make a change, you know, it's not sufficient for having a big enough global impact, because there are other countries who are upcoming and who also want to enjoy the pleasures connected to the, you know, economic and well-being and the food and the meat consumption. And so it is just, I'm sort of very hesitant of making any really even very strong statements on that, because this can only be dealt with by global dialogue, by dialogue with the various nations, and any kind of easy solution is definitely not feasible for them. And I'm quite actually, and many people are worried about China getting more and more powerful, and I understand. I wouldn't want to live in the Chinese system. Obviously, that's not in tune with with negative freedom, plurality, what we have achieved, you know, the values we cherish in Europe and in Northern America. However, on the other hand, and sort of, if for example, what China is doing right now in Africa, in various African countries, might actually be quite, at least economically, quite helpful for these African countries.
Right.
I mean, so in China, the salaries go up significantly as a consequence, and people they don't have enough workers to do the work, the cheap work which they used to do in the electronic factories. As a consequence of the salaries going up, now they are creating, they're establishing bonds with various countries in Africa, and they're building factories there. Originally, I thought, well, the reason for this was they want to exploit the precious soils from these countries. But actually, upon further investigation, I realized this is, this is not the prime motivation. The prime motivation has to do with how high this. It's simply getting the workers are getting too expensive in China. So as a consequence, they're investing in various countries in Africa, and but in order for them to have the factories which can produce these electronics, they need to promote the infrastructure. They need to promote the factories there. They need to promote the cars which take the stuff to the ships, which then gets transported to Europe or the United States. And if you transport the laptops and the PC or the smartphones to Europe, then it's much shorter than if you transport it from China, which is much better for the environment again. Then if you if you need more workers in African countries, then you need to take care that the training, the education they gets improved, which again makes the people better off financially. Maybe they also want to install their Chinese value system, which is more problematic, obviously. However, at least, maybe less people are socially better off, less people are suffering less, starving less. So I see the challenges, obviously, right. Also political challenges, but I mean, the way China is promoting and developing the infrastructures, education in certain countries, that might be more beneficial for these countries than the aid the Western countries has given them in the past 30, 50 years, because that was not as sustainable as what is being taking place here. So it seems to me that there are too many people, too many visible people who say, like, one solution fits all, and China is bad and the US is good, whatever.
Right, China's become the new boogeyman. And
exactly.
It's sad because, sorry to interrupt, but like China, like I really like Chinese history. I actually have like a little section in my little library just filled with Chinese books, literature, and what most people don't understand about or don't know is that we criticize China for stealing our technology. However, back in the 19th century, the United States did the same thing with the Britons and other European, like other, progressive countries. So like, this is just a cycle that humans do. You can look at it as stealing, or you can look at it as a form of borrowing. And not even borrowing, it's just like using the ideas to enhance humanity as a whole, and then they'll do their own thing with that. And another thing, like with China, like what they're doing in Africa, there was this interesting study done on communications where they would ask these students in specific countries in Africa where the Chinese is really, they've ingrained themselves, they've ingratiated themselves rather into the culture by, taking over news stations and things like that. And it was funny because you read this study and what they were trying to see is what news did they prefer, their local news or the Chinese news? And they wouldn't tell them which was which, like where they were getting their sources from, who was providing it. And when it was unknown, most people thought that the Chinese news agency was more objective and just a better source of information. But as soon as it was revealed that, this is the Chinese source and this is the local source, their opinions flipped automatically. And so this is just like, this is true, I think, for even in the US. Like, we like to criticize RT news, right? The Russian Times or whatever, yet it appears to be more objective.
Russia Today, yes. Yeah.
Russia Today.
Yeah.
Yep. It appears to be more objective than a lot of the CNN or Fox News. And so China, I think, falls into that same and same with Russia. Like, and I think the biggest issue when it comes to China is we tend to, or with any governments, really any nation, is we tend to lump the citizens with their governments. And they're like two different things. And and like what you were saying with and just to tie in some other things that you were saying too, like with the factory farming, I completely agree with you that that's wrong. I think that's where maybe lab grown meat has a place to substitute that. But then arguably, is it, one can make the argument that it's not going to be as nutritious as actual meat. And so there's even a debate there. So there's a lot of nuance in what you're talking about. And I acknowledge that. And I think personally, when it comes to the food thing, people should take more responsibility when it comes to their food. That's my perspective. Like, it doesn't take too much to own a couple chickens, to own a couple goats, and that'll actually help the environment. It'll help a lot of things, in my opinion. And as far as like climate change, that's also a tough one, right? Because there's debate within the community. Is it global warming? Is it global cooling? Nobody really knows. The experts don't really know. So that's why we just call it climate change. And yeah, the climate is changing, but what's causing it? There's debate and a lot of tension, and it's been politicized, that conversation. Just like I think eventually we're going to see the politicization of food. I think that has a lot to do with the vegan movement, and then you got the carnivore movement. They're diametrically opposed to one another, and I think that it's going to be politicized as we go down these roads more. And it's unfortunate, but I think this is also just normal for humans to do, because we got to have a sense of identity, right? And this goes back to the whole social contract. Where are you going to align yourself with? And
actually, yeah, when it comes, for example, climate change, obviously, no, we do have our actions. More carbon dioxide emissions leads to an increase of temperature. However, and that is important to keep that in mind. There have been major events of life extinction before humans were there on Earth. At least, I think, 4 or 5 extinctions took place as a consequence of, natural events, because humans were not there yet. When the dinosaurs got extinct, that was not the consequence of human action. And the same applied to, 4 different extinction events which took place before humans. So even if we so these events they were not obviously not caused by humans, but now we humans influence things. But if we let nature go its course, that doesn't mean it does not lead to extinction. So that's and it's again moving against sort of the false dichotomy between the good, nature good, technology bad. And actually, in order to demonstrate that further, it is a way, a proper green lifestyle, a vegan lifestyle, maybe can only be generated by means of technology, if this is what one wants. Actually, there was a wonderful case. There was a young boy. He was invited as a speaker to Taipei, to National Taiwan University. A couple of years when I was there too. And he was. I mean, the event was organized by first years, by undergraduate students in the NTU, which is the best, best university in Taiwan. And he was 15. He was 5 years younger than the students who organized the event. And he was invited because he was part. I mean, he was of Indian origin. He grew up sort of in the Silicon Valley surroundings. His parents probably connected there, but he from at that age he already got involved in a project, also run in Stanford, dealing with gene modification. So he played around with our genes, with CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing, at an age, as a beginning of the teenage years. And he managed to, he's a biohacker, and together with others in his group, he managed to change the genes of yeast into lactose. So lactose is sort of the fundamental aspect of cow's milk and the basis for producing proper cheese from cows. So here, what he established together with a group of people, he established real vegan cheese. Normally, vegan cheese is made out of almond milk, hazelnut milk. So it does not include lactose. And as a consequence, it has a specific taste. It doesn't take, the specific good taste which comes from the lactose, which comes from the cow's milk, is not part of that traditional vegan cheese which uses almond milk. So, and he, by modifying the genes of yeast, creating lactose, he created the foundations of creating vegan milk, which is chemically identical to, the cow's milk, and playing around with that, they are still developing various different types of cheese, real vegan cheese, and they work on the different tastes, and so in Eastern Asia, but also in Silicon Valley, the people responded. I mean, the students, they wanted to take a photo with him. They thought, well, that is really, really cool. What you're doing with 15, and you're changing the world with this invention. You're realizing by means of gene technologies, you're creating a green, a sustainable, vegan lifestyle. Technology and veganism doesn't have to be in conflict with each other. That's also, multi-million-dollar business. You can revolutionize the dairy industry. The cows don't have to be stored like that. That could have an enormous implication on the world. They wanted to take a picture with him. They were, fascinated. When I mentioned this story, when I mentioned the story of that young boy in the continental European context, the responses I usually get was, well, a poor boy, he didn't have a childhood. He should, go out and play soccer with his friends instead of playing around with genes. And if he's messing around with the genes, and he might be, messing them up, and it might lead to human extinction. He's a danger to society, and he didn't have a childhood. One should stop him from doing so. This is the responses I get here in the continental European climate, which is extremely hostile to gene technologies. And so many of the suggestions I have, when I mention them in the US, then, people who are not even too liberal to open that, of course, we all share that. When I mention that in continental Europe, they say, you're crazy. This is too extreme. And so one always has to take the various, the social, the cultural background into consideration. And so here and this is, I thought at least it was a wonderful example of showing sort of that hostility of members of the Green Party in Germany. The members of the Green Party say gene technologies are evil. But here, this is, what about that example? No, it doesn't it demonstrate that, even if you want, if you want to embrace such a green lifestyle, isn't it the case that you really can do so only properly by embracing these technologies, by using these technologies in order to, create vegan milk, vegan cheese, and what else do you want? What does it mean to solely affirm nature? Do you want to, get rid of houses, no vaccines, no antibiotics, live, crawl back upon the trees? That's just not, we don't really want that. We like our clothes, we like our central heating, and it's good that we have that. And so we need to, instead of, having a stupid dichotomy and a stupid reaction to technology, we need to find about the ones which are the technologies which are in our interest, and in how far do we want to use them. That's a tricky enough question anyway, but we should embrace them. And then we need to discuss, and this is only works out in a discussion among members from various parts of society, from members with a different expertise. What is the appropriate application, and how far should it be used? And this is a discussion we should have, instead of just saying technology is something bad.
I completely agree. And I think that it's natural, though, for humans to just take things to the extreme, like to see how far we can take something. And for whatever reason, that's a scary thought to some people. I guess I can understand it if if I'm being empathetic, but going on to gene editing technology, we discussed this briefly before we actually started recording, and I see it as a it's just an extension of what we're already doing in the real world with certain materials, such as like in the chair I'm sitting on, we manipulated certain materials to make this chair what it is today, and so I just don't see where the difference is once you start doing it internally on the human. And I think that there seems to be this disconnect from the manipulation we do in nature for making homes, making cars to improve our lifestyle externally. And then once we try to do the same thing, biohacking or, increasing the health span by gene editing, there seems to be this repulsion towards it. And this has to go with the fact that we still have this false dichotomy of technology and nature when it's really intertwined.
Exactly. And actually, one can even go so far that education has always been genetic modification. And I can explain that by reference to epigenetics.
I was just about to say that, yes.
No, and sort of epigenetics was not a theory for a long time. Darwinism, for a long time, evolutionary theory was hostile to epigenetics. In the past, I don't know, 30 years, more and more people have embraced, have realized, have discovered epigenetic processes. There was Eva Jablonka I was in close contact with, and she's summarized a lot of examples of epigenetic processes, which even led to evolutionary changes, which had consequences on for the offspring of the offspring, for the offspring just. So not only on the individual genetic level, but also for the further generations. So she's demonstrated that for humans, for animals, for plants, it is the case that education, nutrition, and environmental circumstances, they don't have to, but they can have epigenetic, they can have consequences on the genetic level. They can turn genes on, they can turn genes off, they alter the way genes are related, which has consequences for the phenomenal levels, for how people look like. And so, and this example alone shows that given a certain experience you've had, a certain cultural surrounding, educational surrounding, is sufficient for having consequences on the genetic level. So education, if you put it more strongly, education has always included genetic modification. Now we are gradually getting better at doing, by means of genome editing, by CRISPR-Cas9 in particular, and we're slowly getting better at consciously making a decision of, making a change which makes someone immune to HIV, and many other diseases at the beginning, and then other capacities. And there's a wonderful video series on YouTube, actually, which is called Kurzgesagt. That's a German term, but there's actually I think it was produced in the US. It's in Kurzgesagt, or in a nutshell. So it's a series in a nutshell, which sort of gives an introduction to many contemporary relevant themes and topics, and gives an introduction to them based on the latest scientific evidence. Extremely well done. So if you want to get a good impression concerning what the potential of genome editing is, there, in a nutshell, Kurzgesagt presents a wonderful 15-minute introduction on the latest scientific insight concerning the potential of genome editing. And I guess once you've watched it, we will, at least then you will understand, there's a lot of potential good in genome editing. That doesn't mean that all genome editing has potential outcome, but to reject it would definitely not be in our interest.
Right. And I think that another thing that reveals sort of like I guess a parallel to switch gears a little bit
Yeah.
to what we're talking about as far as these human desires or way of thinking, how society operates is once we go into the crypto world, I tend to see a lot of parallels in nature with the technology there. A lot of people are fearful of this too. I like to get a full perspective, a holistic perspective on the side like these technologies. So I follow people who are very anti-blockchain, anti the genetic modification, etc. Then I also follow people who are really for it. So I think that's the best way you can kind of formulate your own way of thinking. It's just to hear all the information out there. But anyway, like when we look at NFTs or what I was thinking of particularly, and are you familiar with NFTs?
Yeah, I've dealt with them. Yes, yes.
Okay, so I can see a parallel there with like the human, and what I mean by that is, for those who don't know, NFTs are non-fungible tokens, basically collectible items, and pieces of art, music, etc. is what it's trying to revolutionize, and it does something like people just think of them as like this JPEG that you buy, but however, there are like layers to them. So like you can buy, for instance, VeeFriends. I'm not
the crypto kitties, no?
right. Exactly. There's crypto kitties. There's crypto punks. The one in particular I was thinking of is VeeFriends, which is a new one, which I'm not invested in. I don't own any of them. So just disclosure, I'm not trying to pump my own bags or anything like that. But there's a cool concept behind them that if you purchase these NFTs, you can then get access to a certain event, right? It's like a QR code incorporated in this artwork. And so where I'm getting at here is these technologies are also just like mirroring us in that, for instance, you and I, there's going to be, we just met each other today. And if the relationship furthers, there may be deeper parts of each other that we gain access to, like any kind of relationship. And so like with NFTs, it's sort of mimicking that real world example between humans. Like the more you put into a relationship, the more like access you'll get. Just like if you're willing to purchase this piece of digital art, you may then, depending on how much you're willing to pay, get access to another layer of it, whether it be like a movie, like Stoner Cats is something that like Ashton Kutcher, Vitalik, and Mila Kunis are attempting to develop. So you buy this piece of artwork, but then you get access to something more. And then same with like blockchain technology, where I tend to see that like an example of consciousness, where you get these stored you get these blocks of information that are always there, which are akin to maybe not consciousness, but maybe epigenetics, right? Where you can, this information is going to be passed down from generation to generation. And so anyway, I just wanted to bring that part up because I do feel like this is also playing a huge role in these conversations of post-humanism, transhumanism, because it's part of this paradigm shift in the economy and culture and arts are so vital to our way of thinking, as we've been talking about for a while now.
Actually, right now, do you know the Immortalists magazine?
Yes, that's actually how I discovered you.
Oh, okay, great. Well, together with the editor of the Immortalists magazine, Dinora Delphine, we're currently, yeah, I can say, yeah, she's already announced it. So we're currently in the process of editing an art issue, maybe several art issues, and so basically, in order to present the implications of emerging technologies in the vast field of arts, and we will deal with some more historical examples like Stellac and performance arts, also genetic arts, bio art like Eduardo Pac, but also, and this is exactly, so crypto art, non-fungible tokens are, these are the central element for these crypto arts. And they have, I mean, recently sort of some of these artworks have been sold for
millions of dollars.
Millions and millions of dollars now. So we need to take them seriously as artworks. And in that context, not only in that context, I actually dealt with, and I get, for a couple of years, dealt with blockchain technology and the implications, also the environmental consequences, because here, in order to generate the scalability issue is actually quite a tricky one. Actually, that's one of the, from my perspective, most severe worries when it comes to, just on a very practical basis. How many operations can be fulfilled at a moment? That's one of the trickiest issues when it comes to blockchain. When it comes to the applicability of blockchain technology, let's say, in order to use a credit card transactions every moment or every couple of minutes, millions of transactions are needed, but that is still not possible for blockchain, because the amount of calculations needed are not an option so far. And so this is, I think, one of the most fascinating issues we need to be concerned with, when obviously the energy consumption related is quite high as well. But it is I'm enormously fascinated. So NFT art, crypto art will be a central aspect of the forthcoming arts issues which come out with Immortalist magazine. So they should be. I'm extremely fascinated by them. I'm down to having. I acknowledge that as a work of art, and I have some understanding, but it's so new that I don't have a fully worked out philosophical stance in order to give a proper philosophical justification.
Right.
That's also when I first encountered bioart. You get an understanding, and then you need to work yourself in to integrate the philosophical interpretation based on the former history of art, and in order to fully acknowledge the relevance and also why it should count as a work of art. And many art historians nowadays still are even hesitant to embrace bioart as a proper work of art. And they are definitely much more hesitant concerning crypto art. But I'm extremely fascinated, and I think this is something which we, from a philosophical basis, also need to get much further reflections on, and on the impact of blockchain technology is enormous, and we need to. But the scalability issue is something.
Right. And I think that comes with decentralized systems. It's harder to scale when you're decentralized. That's why, a lot of these blockchain projects, or a lot of companies that attempt to use blockchain, I think is a little naive, because in order to make it really work on a corporate scale, you need something centralized, because you can actually scale with centralization. Okay. So that's a huge issue with blockchain. So I agree.
Exactly. And just sort of, yeah, there are some other practical issues,
right,
concerning just, storing the private key, issues of right. Inheritance. If you store it with a company, with someone else, then you need to trust the others. Again, it's a more centralized system. So it is the temptation to bring in some kind of centralization is extremely high, always for practical issues. And yeah, I haven't found any proper way of dealing with that, or I haven't even come across a proper solution of avoiding the centralizing tendencies now.
Right. I think it's sort of inevitable. Like if you look at Bitcoin, for example, that's supposed to be decentralized, but most of the currency is owned only by 2,000 wallets. And that doesn't mean there's 2,000 individuals with it. It can be multiple, it could be a certain person with multiple wallets. So the real number of ownership is unknown. We just know the wallets. So it's sort of an inevitable thing. But what I think is sort of going to change the way we interact. We already have this concept of globalization. We were alluding to free trade earlier when it came to China moving locations because it was becoming too expensive there. And that's sort of a byproduct of free trade. You get this free migration or the free labor. You're trying to go to cheaper labor, and free trade allows you to do that. There's a lot of benefits and cons to that as well. But anyway, with this globalization that's taking place, it appears to me that this technology is going to sort of put into serious question the validity of borders when you don't need, this. If what I'm saying makes sense to you.
So the initial idea actually was sort of that idea of centralization. When I talked to Vitalik, then I don't know, 6 years ago, I guess it was, at the beginning when he launched that, and he told me sort of it is not just something he wanted to apply to. It was not primarily the idea of just finding a more way of transferring money from A to B. It was really the idea of, we need to decentralize the internet. It can be applied to all different aspects of the internet. And we can see that happening. And now with CryptoHeart, that's another step in this taking place. And also, I mean, in the way, I don't, with NFTs, you see, it's like a signature. This is your individual, this is your specific piece of art which you have. It's the same way as when we started to have reproductive art, when we created prints in the history of art. You printed something and then you signed it and then you wrote, this is number 1 out of 50, 1 out of 500. And this is now being done with NFTs. And it's just the same process. It's now, it's just moving away. It is moving away from that one individual, that one truth, which we talked about, to more pluralistic concepts. However, it does not undermine the possibility of there being some kind of individuality, some specificity. It can be identified, and that's why it can be, it can be bought, it can be collected, it can fulfill also the function of a traditional work of art. In many circumstances, this is a way of, in many circumstances, actually, it's quite interesting to see that in history, art has always had a social function, a strong social function. Also, just a way of demonstrating someone's strengths in a way. I mean, it is. Imagine we live in a naturalist world where people are fighting for survival in order to have something to eat, and then there are composers or sculptors, and they dedicate their lives to creating musical forms, to creating things, hats carved out of marble. That is totally absurd. From an evolutionary perspective, one could think, this is a totally nonsensical activity, but it needs to be, I think one gets a better grasp of the meaning of the art, from the social meaning of the art, in the sense of here it's part of a social distinction. Right. I've got the free time to dedicate myself to a totally worthless activity. It doesn't help me to live, to survive better. But I play around with musical forms. I play around with marble, with different types of forms. I create something. I've got the free time to do so, and that shows your own, from like a Hobbesian, from a Nietzschean Hobbesian perspective. I've got the sufficient amount of means, financial means, to do so. I can do so. That's demonstrating my strength, my social position as an artist. And that doesn't get undermined by things being created digitally as type of crypto art. The same, I've got the means to afford, something which anyone could copy, a crypto work of art. But, so the same basis could apply. And it's, I can have my own art museum online and demonstrate it to the others. And it is still, I know it is mine, in the sense, this belongs to me. And all the people from the blockchain community know that it is me, because it is part of the, it is my private key is associated to this one. And with the public key, this becomes visible to the rest of the world. This is mine. And so um, 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 it becomes part of my identity of who I am. This is my collection. This is my taste. I create me as a work of art, and my artworks are an extension of me as a personality, of maybe of, you know, talking about contingent nodal point. I'm giving shape to my life, to my identity by means of the artworks which I'm paying for, which I buy, which I put on display in my own little digital art museum. And that makes fully sense, in the sense that it is a meaningful activity, and it also can be helped as a way of creating of a way of maybe for oneself by being engaged with the various artworks you're confronted with. Or was it, you know, this kitty was bred from these other kitties, and you see that it's very particular. It might not be beautiful, but it's got certain character traits to which you can relate to, and you buy it, and therefore you find a way of engaging with who you want to be, with how you see yourself, or how you want to be seen by others. So it's a way of creating some kind of determining your own identity, maybe of realizing how you want to be. And so this is a way I see these artworks, and this is in tune with how art is being used in the history. There's always been a change, but with a focus concerning the relevance in society, what is being shared. When the angels or the, you know, were put in the cathedrals in the Middle Ages, that was generally shared, and there was one meaning. Now, sort of, we're moving away from the one general meaning, God being that, to each human, each person creating their own identity and creating their own meaning and their own. We're all turning into little gods. No, but we're creating our own identities, at least in this way. And that might help ourselves in giving shape to our lives, in giving meaning to our lives, at least in maybe also in realizing who we are or who we want to be.
Right. I think that was very beautifully put. And I think that, you know, it's like, I think there's a cycle when it comes to spirituality that's like, you know, if you look at the oldest record of, you know, that we have for like civilizations, you have like animism, then you have polytheism, then you have monotheism. And I think where we're sort of heading towards now is like what you're saying, where we realize we're the creators in a sense. And it's a fascinating idea. And I think that you're totally right when it comes to the artwork. You know, it's a way that you can identify yourself and express yourself, as well as it's a social symbol, right? I mean, that's why people like to buy nice $100,000 Rolexes, to show that they have the money to waste on a watch that's not that great at telling time, that your smartphone's better at telling time than, right? And so these are all just these, it's just a part of human nature, as we've been talking. You know, these are things that I think should be embraced as we're just adapting to the times. And there's good and bad with all of it. And I think it really comes down to how you're going to perceive it yourself. Because in the end, I do believe in the idea that perception is reality. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. Doesn't necessarily mean that your reality is correct. But once again, that's sort of subjective. And anyway, I think that this has been a really, really interesting conversation we've been having. I've definitely learned a lot when it comes to philosophy in general, what your work is, what you're doing as far as your work goes. And it's promising what you're doing, because I think that, at least from what I know, that it's an attempt to converge the good of these new paradigm. I think it's just a new paradigm in which we're entering, and it's an honor to be able to speak with somebody who's at the forefront of you know, these thoughts, and trying to help in this paradigm shift. And so, yeah, I really do appreciate you taking the time to come on and have this conversation with me. And is there anything that you would like to tell people as far as like where they can find your books, where they can find more of your work?
Yeah, and we've covered a lot of ground, from truth to art and back to truth again. It's been wonderful talking to you. Maybe, if you want to get a better overview over the various post-human discourses, there was a post-human studies reader that was edited by Evi Sampaniko and Jan Stasienko. They're two professors who basically edited a collection of classic texts from transhumanism, critical posthumanism, as well as metahumanism. And if you want to have an insight into the various topics, introduction to posthuman studies, that's a wonderful starting point. It also includes the final section on metahumanism, but also classic texts from transhumanism and critical posthumanism. And so this is just came out as a hardback and in a digital version, but in a couple of months, I guess it will also be out as a cheaper soft cover version, and that's available on all the big bookseller sites, obviously. And yeah, so I really strongly recommend that reader. I think for anyone interested in these topics, this is a wonderful book. And I'm right now really, and I've mentioned that before, but I've just done the final touches on this. We've always been cyborgs. I've put a lot of, this has really been, this is the book I'm most proud of. This is like 100,000 words long. It took me quite some time, to complete that. And that's coming out in a couple of months with Bristol University Press. So I'm already looking forward to engaging with further getting criticism also on these thoughts, because only by means of criticism, I realize sort of what people wonder, are concerned with, and make me think, is there something I didn't consider appropriately? Is there something, where I've got a blind spot which needs to get revised? Or is there something which is simply a matter of not communicating something, with using the right words? And so these dialogues are a way of promoting exchanges. And so if you, and maybe as a final comment, if you are working on something related to the post-human, in 2017, I've established the Journal of Post-Human Studies together with Penn State University Press. I did that together with James Hughes and Sang-Yu Shin Sang-Yu is from Ewha University in South Korea. And we've established that first double-blind and peer-reviewed academic journal dedicated to the first journal explicitly dedicated to the post-human. And if you're interested in these fields from an academic perspective, get that journal or submit your own, thoughts, reviews, and reflections in that journal. But anyway, it was an enormous pleasure for me, talking to you today. And hopefully we'll be able to have the chance to meet up sometime, also personally at some event or so. So, and good luck with that wonderful, wonderful series which you've established here.
Thank you very much. And I'll be sure to post a link to the description with where they can find your work, where they can find your website, and even your social media stuff too. So that way, if people want to keep up with you, they can, follow you. And yeah, so I'll be sure to post a link in the description. So it's been awesome. And yeah, man. So I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and maybe we can have future dialogues similar to this.